Have you ever gotten stuck on one tiny cheese making detail and thought, why doesn't anyone explain this clearly? This is so normal. When I was starting out, countless small, confusing questions tripped me up all the time. But after making hundreds of cheeses, the confusing parts are less confusing. So in this video, I'm going to clearly explain 17 confusing cheese-making details to help your process become easier, safer, and more relaxing and intuitive and fun. And if you're serious about cheese making, I've made a document filled with a ton of foundational information to help clear up as much of your cheese-making confusion as possible. It's free and the link is below the video, so make sure to check that out if you want to level up. One of the biggest hurdles I faced when I first started making cheese was that I had gallons and gallons of milk coming in each day, but I didn't know anyone around me who knew how to make cheese. How do you learn how to make cheese when you don't know a single cheesemaker? Over and over again, I found myself wishing for a cheese-making grandma to explain the cultures to me and how to age the cheeses and the different recipes and techniques. Well, for me, I got lucky. One day, a friend casually mentioned that she had a coworker who knew how to make cheese. Perhaps he would be able to show me something. And that's how I found myself standing in a stranger's kitchen, watching him stir curds and sprinkle dill into a Havarti. Yeah, it was a little awkward. And honestly, he was quite new at making cheese himself. You know what? That didn't matter. Just being there, seeing his tools and his process and how he worked in his kitchen gave me a huge confidence boost. Suddenly, cheese making felt way more doable and less intimidating. And it didn't stop there. It wasn't long before we connected with a couple other local cheesemakers. And now we have our very own little cheese making group. We only meet a couple times a year, but those gatherings have been invaluable. Nothing beats the experience of meeting with other cheesemakers in real life. So if you're serious about making cheese and you don't have a cheesemaking community, build one. Even just finding one or two other people, and they could be even total strangers at first, can make all the difference. When I was a kid, my mother would freak out if me and my brothers didn't put the milk away right away after we used it. If you leave it out, it's gonna go bad, she'd say. So you can imagine my confusion when I started making cheese and saw that the ingredients called for letting the milk that had already been warmed sit out for a couple hours at a time. How could this possibly be safe? Why didn't the milk spoil while it was sitting there? Eventually, I learned that even though I am using fresh, unprocessed milk, and even though it never gets anywhere even close to pasteurization temps, the slow, gentle warming of the milk creates a stable environment that prevents the harmful bacteria from thriving. Also, as the milk becomes more acidic, it is less hospitable to bad bacteria. So there you go. That was one question I had about heating the milk. But there was another one too, and it was about how the milk is heated. Some people heat their milk in a double boiler, some people use a sous vide, and other people will heat it directly over the stove, or in some places of the world, they heat it over an open fire. So which was the right way to heat milk, and did it even really matter all that much? Well, here's the deal. If milk heats unevenly, you risk denaturing its delicate proteins. And when these proteins denature, calcium escapes. And that calcium is absolutely essential if you want to have a firm, stable curd. The truth is that all three of these methods can all heat the milk effectively and do just fine. For me, complicated setups like double boilers and sous vides aren't practical. Since I typically work with 8 gallons of milk at once, I'm simply not strong enough to maneuver that much milk. Plus, I have a fabulous pot that heats my milk slowly and evenly, even on high heat. And if you're curious about what type of a cheese pot I use, I share all the links to my recommended products at milkslinger.com. The bottom line for heating up milk is that there is no one right way. Experiment, consider your batch size and your kitchen setup, and then just choose the method that works best. But I had yet another question about milk. You think milk is a really simple thing until you begin making cheese, and then, whoo, all bets are off. Anyway, this is the question I had. How on earth could milk that has already been warmed to the target temperature sit out for a couple hours and not cool down? For those of you who are new to this, there are two main stretches of time when milk is required to sit out during cheese making. The first time is after you add the cultures to the milk is left to ripen or ferment for an hour or more. And the second time is after you add the rennet to the milk, you let the milk sit until the curd sets up. I worried that if I let the milk sit at that temperature for that long, that the temperature would plummet, and that drop in temperature would cause damage to my cheese later on. It turns out that doesn't actually happen. The temperature may drop a little, but the thing is, milk has a higher thermal mass than water. This means that milk, which is richer and more denser, holds onto its heat better. And then once you add the rennet, milk's thermal mass actually increases, and so it holds onto its heat even more. Now, it is true that milk's temperature will drop slowly over time, but the key word here is slowly. A few degree drop isn't really going to impact your final product all that much. So you can let your milk sit out and trust that its thermal mass will hold onto the heat, and just don't worry about it. Now, this next thing might sound silly, but if you've ever felt thrown off by an unfamiliar cheese making term, and I'm going to cover several of them in this video, you know how quickly a small confusion can drain your brain power. So the clearer you get on cheese making language, the smoother the whole process becomes. So what's the silly thing that tripped me up? In cheese making recipes, whenever you add something to the milk, cultures, annatto, rennet, the instructions always say to stir in an up and down motion. Now, as someone who has spent my entire life cooking, I have stirred, whisked, beaten, folded, kneaded, and blended, but never once have I been told to stir in an up and down motion. It honestly sounded weird. Why couldn't I just stir the milk in circles like normal? It turns out there's actually a good reason for this. Stirring up and down is actually more effective at evenly distributing the ingredients, and it's more gentle. If you stir too aggressively, you can actually end up breaking apart the fat globules and denaturing the proteins, both of which can compromise the quality of the final cheese. Furthermore, circular stirring creates a whirlpool effect, pulling in extra oxygen, which can introduce unwanted bacteria into the cheese. So for the most part, I've acclimated to up and down stirring. Though to be honest, sometimes I still do stir in a circular motion. Sometimes I actually vigorously beat the milk just because I want to. I haven't noticed any problems, so you can get away with breaking form a little bit, but it's probably best not to. Now, this next thing is something that beginning cheesemakers often wonder about. If you don't know the answer, it can really hold you back from getting started. And it's this: what kind of pot should you use to make cheese? Think of it like choosing the right kind of shoes for a hike. Pick the wrong kind and the whole experience becomes frustrating. The same goes for your cheese making pot. The good news is there are 3 kinds of materials that your cheese pot can be made out of, and it will be perfectly fine. And there's several kinds that you absolutely should not use. The 3 that are great are stainless steel. This is your safest, easiest, and most common cheese pot of choice. The other kind is enamel coated, but make sure there are no chips in the enamel, because if there are, they can expose the milk to unwanted materials. And the third kind that you can use is copper. Copper is traditionally used for raw milk cheeses that are Alpine style. These are specifically good because copper has antimicrobial properties, but copper does require extra care. Copper has got to have the proper patina. If that is damaged, the copper can leach into your cheese. On the flip side, do not use aluminum pots, though you can use aluminum pots that are coated with stainless steel. You should not use non-stick coated pans, and you should not use cast iron. Cast iron reacts with the milk and can leave a flavor in your cheese. Now, if you're not sure what your pot is made of, here is a simple trick. Grab a fridge magnet, and if it sticks, it's stainless steel. Ta-da! This test also goes for your stirring utensils and anything else you want to use. This small kettle, which I use for 1-gallon cheeses, it's pretty much an aluminum kettle, I'm pretty sure. So here's how I think about it. All your materials don't have to be perfect, but if you are making long-aged wheels of cheese, there's no point in going to all that work for nothing. As you dive into cheese making, you will quickly notice that some recipes might call for 2 gallons of milk, while other recipes might casually mention that you need, say 50 gallons. As a home cheese maker, you often need to adapt recipes, which brings up the next big question. How exactly does changing the size of the milk batch impact the recipe? Are there special rules for scaling a recipe up or down? Fortunately, ingredients scale proportionally. If a recipe calls for 2 gallons of milk and you want to use 8 gallons of milk to make your cheese, simply multiply all the ingredients in the recipe by 4. Likewise, temperatures and pressing weights remain the same. What does change is the time involved. It takes longer to heat up a larger amount of milk. So when you're told to slowly increase the temperature to the target temp over 30 minutes, this means that if you're using more milk, you're gonna have to crank that heat up to try to get that milk to heat up within that allotted amount of time. Likewise, if you are scaling back the recipe, you may have to turn the heat off occasionally so that the milk heats slowly over that allotted amount of time. Now here's a tricky one. We all know that the milk is supposed to be beautifully pristine, but if you have ever milked an animal, you know there is nothing pristine about farm life. Bits of hair, pieces of straw, flecks of manure, flies, they all find their way into the milk pail at one point or another. And for every visible piece of dirt, you know there are countless invisible pieces that have made their way into the milk. It's enough to drive you crazy if you think about it for too long. So the question is, how much much dirt is too much dirt? What if a piece of straw falls into the milk pail? Is that okay? What about a quarter-sized piece of manure? What about a fly? What about 5 flies? What is the statute of limitations for how much dirt can be in the milk and for how long it can be there before it's a problem? Ultimately, every cheesemaker has to figure this out for themselves. But let me share what we do as a starting point. We use a milking machine, not necessarily for cleanliness, but because it saves time and it saves my husband's hands. The machine we use has a lid which keeps out the vast majority of all the dirt. Even so, we always strain our milk through a filter. There are always little bits of hair or fuzzies or flecks of dirt in there. Even though we have a lid on the milker, you can find our favorite filters and milking recommendations at milkslinger.com. Even with all those precautions, once in a while, when we pour that last bit of strained milk into the jars, we will see a little glob of something brown at the bottom of the bucket. Here's how we handle it. First of all, we freak out a little bit. Like, is it poop? Is it dirt? What is in the milk? If it's a small amount, what we'll often do is either pasteurize the milk, heat it to 160 degrees and then cool it back down, or use that milk to make yogurt or mozzarella, which is pasteurized during the process. If it's really bad, then, you know, the pigs get a treat that day. In all our years of making cheese, none of us have ever gotten sick, so there's that. So now this next thing has to do with my nose. When I first started making cheese, I was nervous about the smells. Do people who make cheese have stinky houses? Would my kitchen smell like sour milk? Would it start to smell funky and weird? Here's the good news, it doesn't. Some days, when I am washing rinds and using the bee linens, it will smell funky like that cheese.
Mom, get it out of the kitchen!
No, I can't
Get it out of the kitchen! Start gagging. Get it out of the kitchen!
But overall, the house smells totally fine. And we spill a fair bit of milk. Sometimes it splashes here and there, and other times it's like a whole wave of milk. But you clean it up and there's no other smell. Your house does not have to smell like a dairy barn. Now, this next thing totally threw me for a loop when I first started out, and it has to do with humidity. Here's the thing, I have always been totally comfortable measuring temperature. I have worked with thermometers my entire life, but humidity measures felt complicated and intimidating. I don't measure humidity for anything else, so I didn't know anything about it. How to control it, what tools to use, how much it would cost. And it felt really, really daunting. But the truth is, controlling the humidity can be as complicated or as simple as you want it to be. For beginners especially, I strongly recommend KISS. Keep it simple, stupid. First, humidity matters because if there's not enough, the rinds will crack. And if there is too much, you will get unwanted microbial growth and the rinds will become slippy and soft. So what's the ideal humidity? Well, it depends on the cheese. Does this mean you have to have a different aging space with different levels of humidity for every single different kind of cheese that you make? No, it does not. I mean, if you're a professional, yes. But for those of us who are making cheese at home, the goal is good enough. Most natural rind cheeses aged at home do best somewhere between 80 and 95% humidity. My cheese cave generally holds steady at right around 90% humidity and it works beautifully. But here is a little secret. You can actually successfully age cheese without even knowing what the humidity level is. The first option is to use a box. The things you want to make sure are that they have a lid and that they're going to be at least twice as big as the cheese that you're going to put in it because you need adequate airflow around it. The only downside to these aging boxes is that they do take up a lot of space. However, the second option is a little trick that I came up with all on my own, and it takes up a lot less space than the aging box. You put your cheese on a wooden board and then you stick it inside a plastic bag and tie that bag shut, therefore making your cheese's own little aging cave. And then the third option is to invest in a vacuum sealer. When you seal the cheese in plastic, you're creating its own little cheese cave and it controls the humidity within that. You can get a decent vacuum sealer for about $75. It is a wonderful, easy, stress-free way to age your cheese without having to worry about the humidity levels at all. I am planning to do a more in-depth video on all the various ways we have aged our cheeses, as well as our newest setup, which is kind of fancy. So stay tuned for that. Now, this next one also has to do with aging, but it's all about the flavor. You may have heard someone say that when they have opened a homemade cheese, they tasted it and then found it bland and then aged it for a few months longer and it was amazing. But does every cheese really get better with age? The short answer is no, not all cheeses improve with age. Here's a quick guide to set you up for success. Some cheeses do not require any aging, and these include yogurt cheese, quark, cottage cheese, ricotta, mozzarella. Then there are the cheeses that age for only a couple weeks. These are often the bloomy rinds, such as the Bries and the Camemberts. If you let these cheeses age for too long, the rind becomes very thick and the cheeses start to smell like ammonia, or as any parent knows, like a pea-soaked diaper. Then there are cheeses that age for just a couple months. And when I say a couple months, It may sound like that's a long time to you, but in the world of cheese making, a couple months is really young. So you're gonna have to adjust your thinking. A couple months, we're good. This is like immediate fast food. These cheeses are the Bel Paese, the Jacks, the Colby's, Fat Cow, and some wash drying cheeses like Munsters. Then there are the medium agers, which are like the cheddars and the Goudas, and these can be eaten anywhere from 3 months to 18 months. And then there are the long agers like the Parmesans and the Gruyères. Generally speaking, higher moisture cheeses have shorter shelf lives and lower moisture cheeses age more gracefully and for longer. So as cheeses age, they will continue to lose moisture. So this means that the longer you age your cheese, the drier and more crumbly and sharper it's going to taste. If that's your goal, then fine. If it's not your goal, then eat it sooner. Now, this next one is another cheese making term that can kind of trip you up. Most cheese making recipes instruct you to air dry your cheese for about 3 days until a rind form and the cheese feels not wet and not dry, but like a clammy handshake. But what does a clammy handshake even feel like? I mean, we know what a clammy handshake is, but when you're talking about cheese, what does it feel like? Some of my cheeses are dry within 24 hours. They never at any point feel clammy. They just feel bone dry. At first, I worried that this meant that the humidity in my house was way off. But then I realized something that's important. Cheesemakers around the world are air drying their cheese at room temperature. And obviously, humidity varies dramatically from home to home, from region to region, season to season, country to country. Clearly, a precise humidity isn't absolutely critical at this early drying stage. What's much more useful is to know what to look for. During air drying, if your rind cracks, it means it is too dry. So if that happens, either vacuum pack your cheese and set it aside for aging, or air dry your cheese in an aging box. On the flip side, if your cheese develops mold or it gets a slimy rind, that's a sign that the moisture is too high. So you need to probably bring a fan into the room and get more circulation going. As long as your cheeses aren't cracking or excessively molding, you're probably doing just fine. There was one other thing about air drying a cheese that felt so weird to me for the longest time. How could a pressed and salted cheese sit out at room temperature for several days or longer and not rot? How was this even possible? Now, it turns out there's actually a pretty logical reason. First, after brining, the salt makes the rind of the cheese inhospitable to unwanted bacteria for a limited amount of time. Second, the combination of salting and then air drying helps to form a rind, which provides a protective layer for the cheese. And third, since the cheese has been acidified with cultures, the acidity of the cheese actually prohibits the unwanted microbial growth. Cheese doesn't rot when you're air drying it because you have already begun preserving it. Now, the next one is about salting. In cooking, we're always taught to season in layers. Salt the onions while they're caramelizing. You salt the meat before you cook it. You salt the broth as it simmers. Each layer is building flavor for a perfectly seasoned dish. But cheese making instructions say to just put salt on the outside of the cheese, either a dry salt or by putting it in a salty brine, and somehow trust that the salt is magically going to reach the center of this honkin' huge piece of cheese. It feels totally backwards. Like, how can the salt even get in there to the middle? Think of salt as being aggressively evangelical. It always wants to spread the good salty news from places where there's lots of it to places that don't have any of it until everything is evenly salted. This salt movement happens slowly, and the speed at which it happens depends very much on the moisture level of the cheese and the cheese's density. So higher moisture, less dense cheeses like brie will absorb the salt much more quickly than denser, low moisture cheeses like Parmesans, which absorb salt very slowly. Here's one pro tip. When it comes to hard cheeses, over-brining generally has no ill effect. But if you under-brine and under-salt your cheeses, that can result in a cheese that tastes bitter, and it can also lead to late blowing if the inside part has not been properly salted. But what kind of salt are you supposed to use? When I first started making cheese, the fact that some recipes called for cheese salt felt confusing. Wasn't salt just salt? I understood that iodized salt wasn't ideal. We actually use iodine to disinfect our cow's teats. So it made sense that iodized salt would potentially harm the good bacteria in the cheese. But beyond that, did it really matter what kind of salt I used? Turns out that yes, it matters. But there are plenty of good options. Here are some salts to avoid: iodized salt, mineral salt like pink Himalaya salt or black salt, flavored salts, and any salt that has an anti-caking agent added to it. Examples of acceptable salts include pickling or canning salt, sea salt, and kosher salt. That said, I recently learned that for the past 3 years, I have been using a non-iodized kosher salt that has an anti-caking agent in it. Oops. And I know some cheesemakers who season their cheeses with the pink Himalaya salt, and I've actually used that myself a couple times. So there is a little leeway within that, but the bottom line is that you always want to check the ingredient list. Pure salt should list just one ingredient, salt. There should not be any iodine, any calcium silicate, or any other additives. You may be able to break the rules. You may be able to get away with a salt that isn't exactly pure, but why risk it? If you know better, do better. Now, this next thing that confused me is about draining cheese. When I first started making ricotta, I noticed that as the curds drained, the pan that the cups of ricotta were in would fill with whey, so that the cups of ricotta were actually sitting in the whey while they were draining. What was keeping the whey from absorbing back into the cheese? Turns out there are a few simple reasons for this. First, ricotta curds are made up of a stable protein network that prevents the curd from reabsorbing the liquid. Second, gravity is actually pulling the whey down and out away from the curds. Third, the ricotta baskets are specifically designed to keep the whey draining down and outward instead of soaking back up in. And fourth, ricotta expels whey for hours. This whey expulsion is called syneresis, and it prevents the liquid from drawing back in, especially if there's a lot of whey surrounding the cheese. So together, these factors keep the ricotta curds nicely drained, even as they are sitting half submerged in a pan of whey. Now, this next one is a tricky one. It has to do with cleaning up natural rind cheeses. Sometimes when you're cleaning up a cheese, the exterior is so moldy that you're worried that you're going to spread that mold to the inside of the cheese. The whole process often felt so complicated. So what is the best way to clean up a cheese rind? Honestly, I'm still not always sure, but I have discovered a simple trick that dramatically reduces the mess and saves a lot of hassle. I wash my cheeses under running water. I know it seems totally counterintuitive to stick your whole hunk of cheese under the spigot, but it turns out the aged cheese holds up really well to hot water and a vigorous scrubbing. Sometimes I even use dish soap, especially when the rinds are greasy from being bandage wrapped. After I bathe my cheese baby, I will pat it dry with a paper towel, and then I can either let it air dry for a couple hours and flip it, or I can cut into it right away. Now, there's still one enormous problem that tons of people struggle with after they learn to make cheese. And without understanding this, people often end up wasting time and money by throwing away their perfectly good homemade cheeses. So if you want to clear up this one other enormous confusion and avoid the mistake that many beginning cheesemakers make, watch this video next.